Good morning to everybody. It's good to see you all here. We've got kids who are at kids camp this weekend out in Huntsville. We've got our youth group, our senior high is in Panama City. Poor guys, right? While we're stuck here wrestling the humidity in Athens there in Panama City. But they'll be back tomorrow, so we want to remember to continue praying for those guys as they're having an encounter with the Lord and hanging out with some other youth group members from other churches in Panama City. So a great thing. We want to continue to remember them in our prayers. Have you ever had that feeling? Maybe you are trying to get somewhere and you don't exactly know how to get there, and you just feel like you are going in circles. Maybe you're driving through a neighborhood. Nothing confuses me more than trying to navigate my way through a neighborhood that I've not been in to find someone's house. And you ask yourself this question, am I just going in circles? Like we've already seen this, right? I think of the old European Vacation where they just keep circling around. You remember Chevy Chase keeps saying, "There's Big Ben, kids. There's Big Ben again." Are you just going in circles? Or maybe you're in a new city. You're trying to find your way through this city. You're trying to navigate, and you just feel like, I've seen this before. I'm crossing my path. Maybe you're trekking through the woods, and you don't have a map or a compass or a GPS. Have you ever felt like you're trying to go straight, but you just end up circling around and going in circles? It seems like it would be basic human instinct to be able to just go straight. But what researchers have shown is that whenever a hiker is found in the woods after they've been lost, whether they've been out for some time, maybe they've been out for a long time, and they finally find the remains of these hikers, what studies show is that more often than not, that hiker is found within a mile from where they started. When we have no bearings, when we have no way to determine the direction that we're going, it seems like our basic human instinct would say, how hard is it to just walk straight in one direction? But what happens is we begin to veer off course. There's a study that was done in Germany. I think my thing here has died, so Brian, if you could, or Cameron, if you could, yeah, thank you. So go to the next slide. This is a study that was done in Germany where a lady named Jan Salmon, she was a researcher, a psychologist. She was asking herself this question: why is it that hikers continue to be found within a mile of where they started? Is it true that people have this inability to walk in a straight line? And so she conducted this study, and it was very simple and basic. What she did is she took 9 people, and people who have zero background. These weren't Boy Scouts who were able to determine, if the moss grows on this side of the tree or if the sun is here. They have zero navigational skills. All right, 9 people, and they put them in the woods and in a desert, and they asked them to do one simple thing: just walk as straight as you can for as long as you can. And so for several hours, they had these people just walk what they thought was straight, and the findings were absolutely unbelievable. Some of them, 4 of the people, so they put 6 people in the woods, 3 people in the desert. 4 of these people in the woods found themselves crossing their paths really, really quickly. You can kind of see these blue squiggly lines right here. These are the people who couldn't walk in a straight line. These yellow ones, these are the people who found a way to walk in a straight line. So the question that they begin to ask then is this: okay, what happens? How come some people can walk in a straight line and some people end up spiraling and going in circles? The study was the same in the desert. Here's one, and then these 2 who had this ability to go straight. And this is what they found. When the sun was out, even though people have zero ability to navigate using the sun, they haven't been trained in this, but when the sun is simply present in the sky, there's something about its presence there that allows people to walk in a straight line. These 4 people were hiking on a day that was outcast. There was no sun to be seen in the sky. It wasn't nighttime. It was just cloudy. They couldn't see where the sun was, and so they found themselves, what they thought going straight, but sort of spiraling and wandering all over the place. The 2 people who made the straight yellow lines there, those are the 2 people who were hiking on days that the sun was high in the sky. So what do we do in the desert? Well, these 2 people were hiking in the daytime. They put this person out at night. When the sun is not present, we seem to have this inability to walk straight. Though we think that we are, we find ourselves spiraling around and circling around. In nature, you even see this. There's studies that show that bees and pigeons On days where the sun is not out, or if you see them flying at night, they fly in tight circles. They just kind of spiral around. Something ingrained in them in their creational design uses the sun to navigate, uses the sun as a little bit of bearing. So how do we make sense of this? I think what we're going to read today in Ephesians is this idea that for most of us, when our eyes are off of the sun, cheesy, I know, but when our eyes are off of Jesus, these become the times where we seem to spiral out of control. Times when we begin to spiral out of control the most are the times where our eyes are the most away from Jesus. It's a simple thought, but one that I believe if we were to do some sort of study like they did here in Germany, we would see in our lives. Okay, there are times where I have been trying to go straight. There's times where I've been trying to do the right thing. I've been trying to walk the way that I'm supposed to go. We'll read about this idea of walking in a moment. Paul uses this metaphor. But no matter how hard I try, if my eyes aren't fixed on Jesus, then I begin to just spiral out of control. I begin to cross my path. And like a rocking horse, though I'm doing a lot of moving here, I'm not really making any progress. I'm just going in circles. If you've got your Bibles open to Ephesians chapter 5, we're going to start in verse 1. And we're going to read this idea that Paul has about walking in Christ. This is sort of, as we've talked about, Paul has given an identity to the church. Now he's giving them a sense of how they are to live. But I want to read this just in its wholeness here. This is verses 1 through 14, and then we'll break it down a little bit. Verse 1, follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. But among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality, or of any kind of impurity, or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. For of this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such person is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Let no one deceive you with any empty words, for because of such thing, God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient. Therefore, do not be partners with them. For you were once in darkness, but now you are in light. Live as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. But everything is exposed by the light, becomes visible. And everything that is illuminated becomes a light. This is why it is said, wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. I believe what Paul is trying to tell us here is a sense of how to walk. I believe what Paul is trying to tell us is a sense of how to walk with our eyes fixed on the Son, with our eyes fixed on Christ, so that we may make the progress as a church and as followers of Jesus that we're called to make, instead of just spinning in circles, feeling as though we're going somewhere, but going absolutely nowhere. So let's back up to verse 1. The very first thing that we see Paul talking about is this idea of walking in love. We talked about this last week, and this is the slide that we ended on last week, as we were talking about some of the ways that our anger and our emotions can sort of get us to spiral out of control. And we ended on walking in love, but I don't feel like we had a proper time or discussion of it. I think there's some things we need to flesh out that Paul is saying here in verses 1 and 2 that are really important for us. But the first is this, walk in love. Look at what he says in verse 1. He says, follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children. Follow God's example. So the first thing we see in verse 1 is that we're to follow God or to imitate God. Some of your translations might say imitate God. And the language that Paul is using here is really, really cool. So if you can remember, this is a first century culture here where there's not a lot of written word going on. Most of the things that are told, most of the histories, most of the education that's going on, most of the entertainment, most of the religious dispersion of ideas and thoughts all happens orally. It's all verbally spoken. And so there were people who were trained specialists, and all they were orators. There are people who were trained to speak loudly and to speak well, to speak in ways that are engaging to people, so that the word of God, or so that the words of history, all of these things can be heard and recalled by people. And like with any job, there were apprentices who would study under master orators, and they would learn how to speak as the master speaks. And so the language that Paul uses is he's adopting some of this idea of what it looks like to imitate. It said that there were three things that an oration or an orator apprentice would do. Number one, they would study. They would study well. They would watch. They would listen. They would analyze the way that the master orator speaks. But the second things were when they really begin to latch onto this. Because if we just study something, it doesn't typically sink in and become manifest in us, right? But the second two things that they would do is imitate and then practice, or imitate and repeat. So I've studied the way that you speak. If you ever watch some like YouTube clips or something of people who are like people who do impressions, then they will watch these people and they'll study their mannerisms, their body language, all of these things. And so what Paul says is this: study God well, then imitate him. Try and put his practices into your practices. Try and make his rhythms your rhythms. Try and make his speech your speech. Watch him so closely and then try and do the things that he is doing, and repeat and practice. So Paul begins by saying, walk in love, follow God, watch him, study him close. Then he uses this language to say, just do the things that you see God doing. Now, this is a tough ask, isn't it? How do we imitate God? How am I to imitate? How am I to even study this divine creator? How can I imitate the things that God does? How can I imitate the character of God? Turn to Colossians chapter 1. Colossians chapter 1, there's a truth about Jesus in regards to God that I believe allows us to get a grasp of what it looks like to be imitators of God. Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 says this: the Son, this is Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Jump down to verse 19. For God was pleased to have all of his fullness dwell in him, in Jesus, and through him to reconcile himself to all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. The truth that Paul reminds us of in Colossians is this mind-blowing, phenomenal truth that when we see Jesus, we see God. He's the image of the invisible God. Want to know how to understand what God is like? Pay attention to Jesus. You know how to put into practice what Paul is saying when he's saying be imitators of God, follow the example of God, put into practice the ways of God? He's saying be imitators, follow the example of Jesus. Do the things that you see Jesus doing. Follow the steps that you see Jesus taking. Learn the rhythms of the way that Jesus loves and acts, and put those things into practice in your life. The second thing that we see in verse 2 expands on this a little bit. He says, walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. So be imitators of God and love like Jesus. Be imitators of God and love like Jesus loves people. So there's something that concerns me when we talk about love, even in the church. And my fear is this, that we live in a culture where this word love, this idea of love, has lost a pretty significant amount of its meaning. And so I'm not bashing this show, so sometimes we can brace up, oh no, he's going to talk about my favorite TV show, The Bachelorette. I heard some people talking about this at our Fifth Avenue picnic last week. And there was two or three high school girls that were talking about The Bachelorette, and I just want to tell you the phrase that I heard them when they were talking about this. I was just kind of overhearing, listening, and they said, no, he's the one who told her that he thinks that he feels like he's falling in love with her. So let's break this down. He's the one who thinks that he feels that he might be falling in love with her. Understand this. That's not saying anything, is it? Like, that's not saying anything. I think that I might be falling in love with you. I might think that I might be falling in love with anybody, right? It doesn't take too much. I don't have to know too much about you. I don't have to have too much of a connection or an investment in you to say that I think that I might be falling in love with you. But I think that this is indicative of the culture and the society that you and I live in. Because we've learned things to say and ways to act, to express the thing that we're supposed to express, and that is that we love you, yet withhold the action that's supposed to come along with this word. I think that as followers of Jesus, we are called to love in ways that are surprising to the world around us. And what the world anticipates, I believe, is for us to continue to say that we think that we might be falling in love with them, and to treat them as though we think that we might be starting to fall in love with them. But if we want to take the world by surprise, what if we actually begin to start loving them? Paul uses a word often in his letters, and notorious for it in Ephesians. When he talks about this idea of Christian love, he uses this word agape. And it's significant because this word agape was one that was kind of a forgotten word in the Greek language. It was a word, it was a valid word, but it was one that hadn't been used so much in culture and society because there was so much significance attached to it. And so the Greeks had all these different forms of love, and they were able to express all these different forms of love and ways of love, but agape was one that no one really uses until the Christian movement begins to take traction. And this word agape has much less to do with emotions. Sure, there are emotions tied to it, but it's much less about emotion and more about sacrifice. And so what Paul says is this: be people who are loving like Jesus, who gives himself up as a sacrifice. Be Christians who are practicing this agape love. Be people who are ready not just to tell people that we think that we might be in love with them, but be people who are prepared to show people that we love them. And this becomes really difficult, doesn't it? Because this requires a lot of us. If we're to be a church who's serious about not just saying, yeah, we love you. People expect the church to say that. People expect Christians to say that. But if we're to be a church who is taking people by surprise, shaking them up and opening up their eyes to this agape love of Christ who has sacrificed so much for us, I believe it calls for us to step out of our comfort zones and to be shaken up and to be rattled and to make sacrifices and to do things that hurt me a little bit and to do things that stretch me a little bit and to sit and to talk to people that I normally wouldn't talk to sacrifice for people. This means more than just saying that we love the addicts, the homeless people, the poor people, the sick, the orphans, the immigrants. It means more than just saying we love them and giving them some of our leftovers. It means stepping into their world as Jesus does, so sacrificially, and making ourselves a little bit uncomfortable, proving through our agape, through our sacrificial love, that I more than just think that I'm falling in love with you. As a follower of Jesus, I love you because I have been loved by the sacrificial love of Christ. So the first thing Paul reminds us of is this intense calling as Christians, that we are to be people who are serious about this call to love. Imitate Christ, follow his rhythms, and love the way that he loves. The second thing that we see is this: not only do we walk in love, but there's also some discussion of walking in obedience. I think it's important to understand, because sometimes as Christians we can sort of think, okay, my main job, my main function is to love. And Jesus says this in Matthew chapter 22, doesn't he? When he's asked, what is the greatest command? Jesus says, love God with everything you've got and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. Why does he say yourself? Because Jesus understands the human heart. There's few things that we love more than ourselves. And so Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. So the greatest command, Jesus says, is to love, but sometimes I think we forget that there are other commands as well. Not only am I just called to walk in love, but I'm also called to walk into obedience. Verse 3, Paul continues, and he's going to detail a little bit of what this obedient way of life looks like. But among you there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality or of any kind of impurity or of greed, because those are improper for God's holy people. So the first thing he says is sexual immorality, and then he moves on to greed. It's interesting, and it's important to note that what Paul is not doing is giving an exhaustive list of the things that we're to abstain from as Christians. I think what Paul is doing is he's giving a quick list of the things that are causing this church in Ephesus to spin in circles a little bit. And so he says, pay attention to these things, because there's some things in your life that just don't belong there. My dad taught this class on sex when I was growing up at our church, and I remember just thinking, every time that quarter rolled around, I'm so embarrassed. I do not want to sit in this class, and we make fun of him for it today. But it was the greatest illustration I've ever seen, and I think Paul would probably give his stamp of approval to it. Dad he would come into class and he would take all this firewood and he would bring marshmallows and matches and stuff, and he would begin to make this fire right in the middle of our classroom. And at first you think it's funny and everything, and then Dad's got his marshmallow stick and he's getting ready to roast, and he takes the matches, lighter fluid, whatever, and you think, he's really about to start this fire, and everyone, of course, is like, no. He says, what's wrong? Fire's okay, right? Fire's good. It's a good thing. We all love to roast them. Yeah. And then, of course, the illustration, he would continue. He would say, there are some things that are perfectly good, and there's some things that are beautiful, like a campfire, but in the wrong context. These are some things that can absolutely cause destruction. I think what Paul is talking about when he talks about sexual immorality and greed is he's talking about these things that seep into our heart, particularly when we're talking about this sexual relationship that we have with other people as humans. He says these are some things that are good and that God has ordained and created as good, but there are some things that can cause you to spiral out of control if practiced in the wrong context. So Paul says, do not let there be among you, church, even a hint of sexual immorality. This word that he uses for sexual immorality is a word called porneia. And it's a word that's kind of a broad, general term in Greek, and it covers a lot of things. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, it's referring to incest. 1 Thessalonians 4:3, it's promiscuity. 1 Corinthians 6:13, it's relations with a prostitute. John 8:41, the story that we heard on Wednesday night, this is talking about this illicit affair. So you see that what Paul is not doing is just sort of targeting in on one specific aspect of this. What Paul is doing is painting with a broad stroke, and he's using this word porneia. Don't even let any of this creep into your church, he says. Any of this sexual immorality. Because these are things that will cause the church more than anything to spiral out of control. Jesus talks a little bit about this. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. We're familiar with this in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5, verse 27, Jesus says, you have already heard that it is said, you shall not commit adultery. I tell you, anyone who even looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. When I read what Paul is saying of don't even let there be a hint, I think of this message from Jesus where he says, listen, don't even let it get close. I think what Paul is saying is don't even toy with this. Don't let it creep into your church. Don't let it come in, because when it does, it'll begin to spiral out of control. We see what happens in 1 Corinthians. As Paul is trying to deal with a church who has opened up the door to the sexual immorality of their culture. Understand this. We as people will very often follow the practices or will adapt to the cultural sexual norms of our culture. Do you have that slide up there, Cameron? Yeah, as people, we tend to conform to the sexual norms of our culture. I don't have to be too specific because we're all living in culture, and I believe we can read it well. We see what's going on in regards to sex in our culture. And this thing that God has created and ordained as good, and this thing that, as Jesus will talk about, and as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, as he talks about, he quotes from Genesis 2, chapter 24, where he talks about man and woman coming together, being united as one flesh. This act of sex that God has created is meant to image what it looks like when we come together with the Father. It's meant to be beautiful. But as my dad showed us when we were in high school, what we've tended to do is we've built a campfire in the middle of the classroom. And we've allowed the cultural norms of the sexual culture that we live in to creep into the church in a place that it just doesn't belong, and take something that was intended for good and turn it into something evil. In 1 Corinthians 6, Paul will talk about this, and he's addressing what has happened in the church. And the idea that they have is this: okay, we are spiritual beings, so why should a sin of our body, our flesh, have anything to do with our spiritual standing with the Lord? This is what he says in chapter 6, verse 15. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I take then the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Do you not know then that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in the body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. But whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside his body, but whoever sins sexually sins against his own body. Do you not know that our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. We get uncomfortable when we talk about this in church sometimes, right? We get uncomfortable when we talk about this with our kids, but there is nothing more important, I believe, for us to talk about in church, and there's nothing more important for us to talk about with our families than what it looks like to have a God-honoring sex life within the confines of marriage. As he's talked about here, Genesis 2:24, when man and woman have come together and God has blessed them with this intimacy. There's nothing more beautiful. May we not adapt to the cultural norms. May we stand firm on the values that we see in Scripture. May we stand firm and not cheapen a good gift that God has given us. I believe what Paul is telling us is this: if you want to keep walking straight, if you want to avoid the things that are going to have you spinning in circles and crossing your path, then avoid sexual immorality. Jesus says, don't even let those lustful thoughts, don't even have them. I used to get stumped up by that as a kid. Jesus says, I've told you, don't commit adultery, but I'll take it one step further. Don't even have these lustful thoughts in your heart. And I would ask my parents, well, how do you do that? How do you abstain? Because as human beings, we just have these lustful thoughts that just pop into our heads. And my mom would say, you can't keep a bird from landing on your head, but you can keep it from making a nest there, right? Flee from it. Take a lesson from Joseph. As Potiphar's wife comes in, he runs so fast out there that she rips his shirt, rips his clothes off, right? Like Joseph, like Jesus is instructing us, like Paul is telling us, may we flee from the things that cause us to spin in circles. He continues in the second part of verse 3. Not only does he talk about sexual immorality as being something that causes us to sort of veer off this way that we're walking with Christ, but the second thing is greed. I don't have to expend too much energy talking about this because we live in a culture that is obsessed with greed, and every single one of us understand it. But if we're hesitant to talk about sex in the church, then we are definitely hesitant to talk about money in the church, are we not? This is like talking about politics at the Thanksgiving table, right? You just don't do it. But Jesus doesn't shy away from it. Listen to what Jesus says. Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. Again, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. There's a guy named Rick McKinney, and he writes a book, Faith for the Moment. And in Faith for a Moment, he talks about what it looks like to minister at this church in Portland, Oregon, a culture that has tried its hardest to shut the Lord out. And he talks about this young man who comes in, and he was a convert, and he was well-known, had a well-known reputation in the city with women, if you get my drift. And he says he comes in, and the church was so ready, and the church was so active in trying to redeem his sex life. And what he tells the preacher is this. He says, everyone is asking me questions about who I'm sleeping with and how this portion of my life has been redeemed, but no one has yet to ask me how I'm spending my money. We don't want to touch that, do we? We don't want to touch this, but here's what Paul says. He doesn't shy away from it. Here we see it in Colossians. What Paul says is this. There's no bones about it. Greed is adultery. Greed is idolatry. This desire, this word for greed just simply means I have a desire for more. What we have to understand is that we serve a benevolent God. And so when we allow this greed to take over our life, the next slide here tells us that we are revolting against the benevolence of God. We see it with Israel. God is trying to train Israel to break this human tendency to be greedy people and to desire more. He gives them the manna. He gives them what they need every morning. And if they store it up for themselves because they want to hoard more, what does he do? He spoils it. God is trying to train us to rely on him, to rely on his benevolence. And this idea of greed is what Paul says is it's idolatry. It creeps in and, like sex, becomes our God. Continue down in Ephesians chapter 5, and you'll see he says this about this all being idolatry. Verse 5, for this can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such person is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Understand this. If sexual immorality, if greed are forms of idolatry, which I agree with Paul, I believe they are, then our morality, our purity, and our generosity become declarations that you and I make as a church and as followers of Jesus to say, we will not allow sexual immorality, we will not allow greed to be our gods. So when I'm generous with my money, when I give, when I rely on the benevolence of the Lord, when I trust Him, when I practice purity as a young person, when I practice holiness and righteousness in the sexual relationship that I have with my spouse as an adult, then what I am doing is I am making a declaration as a follower of Jesus to say, I will not allow sex or money to be my God. Because there is nothing, I believe Paul tells us, that makes us spiral out of control like those two things. Lastly, we walk in obedience, we walk in love, and then lastly, we walk in light. Look down at verse 8. Verse 8, Ephesians 5 says this, for you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of the light, for the fruit of light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth, and find out what pleases the Lord. I read a lot of commentaries this week, and there was one thing that was pretty much common in all of them. People point to this verse, commentators, scholars point to this verse and say that it may be the best verse for illustrating what conversion and the transformational power of Christ looks like in a person. Notice the way that he says this. It doesn't say that you were in darkness, as Paul is prone to say often. No, he says you were darkness. Darkness described you. Darkness, you embodied darkness. But now you are light in the Lord. There's a significance to what Paul is saying right here. In John chapter 8, what we see is, 1 John, we'll start with God. What we see 1 John 1 through 5, what we see John saying is this, that God is light. 1 John chapter 1, verse 5, he says, this is the message that we have all heard from him and declare to you, God is light. In him, there is no darkness at all. So number one, understand this. What John tells us is that the perfect description of God is that he is light. Not that he is in light, not that he has created light, but he is light. All right? Continue on in John chapter 8. What we see is Jesus now speaking. When Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, I am the light of the world. Now, Jesus is embodying light. Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Stepping into a dark place, Jesus is now the light, as we read, Paul talks about, that comes down and descends and illuminates and fills the world. Now, pay attention. What we've seen John saying so far is this, that God is light and that Christ is light. But now listen to what he says to the church, to followers of Jesus. Verse 8, for you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. You are light. We become what he is. We become what he is. He is light. Christ is light. And now as followers of Christ, reconciled and justified to God by the sacrifice that we see Jesus making on the cross, you and I become light. But we have to continue to walk in the light. He says, live as children of the light. For the fruit of light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. Find out what pleases the Lord. Live to please the Lord. Exist to please the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. Do you guys remember, I think our last slide here, there's these things that kids had on their bedroom ceilings. Maybe they still do. When I was a kid, these were big things, but there were these stars, and they would light up at night. But there's something about these stars. The way that they work is this. For them to glow, they first have to what? They have to be exposed to the light. For them to glow, they have to be in the light. And so I can hold one of these stars up to a light for a period of time, and I can stick it on my ceiling. And as long as that light's been on during the daytime, it's absorbing, it's soaking in, it's taking in this light from the source, whether it be from the sun, whether it be from the light in the room, and it'll shine all night long. But what happens if that light is turned off for a significant amount of time? Well, the stars just don't seem to work. You see, they operate off of proximity to the light. Here's what I think Paul is trying to tell us. You who were once darkness are now light. So live in the light. Stay in the light. Expose the ways of darkness. Flee from the ways of darkness, because when you do that, you're going away from the light source. And you won't stay lit too long. The longer that we are out of the presence of God, the easier and the more quickly you and I begin to start running in circles again. Paul tells us, what Paul reminds us this morning in Ephesians chapter 5 is a couple of basic things. We are walking in love, imitating Christ. We are walking in obedience, trying to flee from the things that cause us to spin in circles. But we're also to walk, staying connected. To use Jesus' language, staying connected to the vine that gives us the life. Walk in love, walk in obedience, and walk in the light. This last portion of the study that Salmon did in Germany there was something where they just simply put people in a field and they just put a blindfold on them. They just wanted to see what would happen. No test subject made it more than 66 feet before they began to start turning in circles. And for some of us this morning, I fear that if we've never had an encounter with Jesus, if we've never had our eyes fixed on him, then this is what we're doing in our life. We're just running in tight circles. We're chasing after our tail. We feel as though we're moving. We feel as though we're progressing, but we're not doing anything really. This morning, I encourage you, if this is you, if you're in this boat, take the blindfold off. Look to the Lord. Follow his example. Learn from his love. Watch him closely. Learn his rhythms, the way that he speaks, the way that he moves, and imitate. And see the way your life begins to correct itself. For some of us, there may just be this simple overcast in our life. The sun is there. He's never went anywhere. Christ has never left. He's always been there. This relationship that you and I have that serves as our beacon and our bearing in this life that has us spinning out of control is always there, but there's things that have clouded it up so much that it's caused a little bit of a spiral. This morning, my encouragement is this. Remove those distractions. Step out of the cloud, step out of the fog so that you may see the sun and so that you may walk straight once again. If there's anyone in here this morning who would like to make a decision to take the blindfold off, to remove the clouds, to walk in love, to walk in obedience, and to walk in the light, we ask that you come forward as we stand together and as we sing.